And welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
I'm back.
It is so good to have you back, Ash. Just what have you been up to?
Oh, thanks, Dana. I have been keeping 2 small humans alive now over this little break. I obviously, as you know, left because I gave birth to my second daughter, little Maisie, who's a couple of months old now. So I've been taking some time to get to know her and stop her big sister from trying to put her in the bin.
Oh, what an adjustment for all.
She's very helpful now.
Oh, that's great. I was going to say, how are things now?
Things are great.
Well, it is absolutely lovely to have you back, Ash. Like, I was trying to carry the banner of icebreakers, and I'm just not as good as you in coming up with those icebreakers, but I'm really, really thrilled to have you back.
Well, I am thrilled to be back. Thank you.
Good. Well, today we'll be reviewing an article that was recently published in 2020 in Clinical Biomechanics titled The Effect of a Running Training Intervention on Ankle Power Generation in Children and Adolescents with Cerebral Palsy, a randomized controlled trial. And today we have the lead author of this paper, Annie Chappell. Welcome, Annie.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Annie.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for being here. Okay, so Annie, as you might know, at the start of every episode, we do a little icebreaker question to help all our listeners get to know all of us and you a little bit more. So the question today is, if your house was on fire, burning down, and all of the things with heartbeats in your house were very safe and outside of the house, and you had to save one material thing in your house, what would it be and why?
Well, I think I would have to save the photos of when my kids were little. I have 4 beautiful teenage and young adult children.
Oh.
So when the oldest ones were babies, we didn't actually take digital photos. We took photos. So
yeah, that's so precious.
And we'd grab those albums.
Yeah.
Nice.
Are you one of those organised people who has them all in albums or?
You get less organised as the children get younger. So the first one's quite well organised, but the 4th one is lacking quite a lot.
I have already noticed that. So end up with 4. Okay, Dana, what about you?
Okay,
what would you save?
Me, well, at first I thought my passport, but I figured I'm not going to use that anytime soon. I ain't going anywhere.
No.
So I would say it would be my lovely crock pot, which is a Le Creuset. And it is a beautiful big one that I cook all my stews in, and I think it's lovely and they're expensive. And
Yes.
I want to save that one.
Yeah. And then wherever you go, you can make delicious food.
Yeah, I can make people happy.
Yeah. That's a really good
Make
idea.
a nice bouffe bourguignon, and I'm not headed to France anytime soon. So there you go. That's what I'll do. And Ash, what would you save?
Oh, it's a hard one. I have a beautiful a blanket that sits over my bed that's like a one-off inspired by a painting by an Aboriginal artist.
Cool.
I would definitely save that because there's no way I'd ever be able to get that again, and it's very, very special.
Oh, see, that's really nice.
And I'm lucky in
that.
that all my photos are on my phone or my cloud, hopefully.
Yeah, got to make sure those automatic uploads do happen.
Yeah,
hey?
absolutely.
Well, everyone's gotten to know us a little bit more now, so let's get into the details.
Absolutely. So we thought we might start by telling you a little bit more about Annie. And Annie has been really busy completing her PhD over the last few years and juggling that with her clinical work as well, which is no mean feat. And I'm in absolute awe of anyone who is able to do all of that, as well as have 4 children and a life. Annie has extensive experience in working with children with disabilities in the community, and this really sparked her interest in the area of running, particularly in children with cerebral palsy. And throughout her PhD, Annie's been training physiotherapists in developing running in children with cerebral palsy. So we're really chuffed that when it comes to knowledge translation, Annie is already way ahead of the game, and we'd love to kind of try and unpack that a little bit more in the episode today, I think.
Oh, yes. I'm really excited about this one. I have to say, I have known Annie for a really long time. And when it comes to someone who's generous, kind, and compassionate, that is definitely Annie. And I'm going to make her feel really embarrassed right now. But because she's so humble, no one will probably know all those features. But, if it wasn't for Annie and what she has done for so many physiotherapists here in WA, I think, where we're at with treatments would be in a very different place. So I'm really excited about this. And I'm so proud of her having finished her PhD and can't wait to get into it.
Absolutely. And I'm really excited to hear more about this paper. So Dana, shall we get into the specifics?
Let's get into it. Okay, so in this study, it was a randomized controlled trial involving 38 children and adolescents with unilateral or bilateral cerebral palsy aged between 9 and 18 years. They all had a GMFCS level of 102, able to walk 10 meters unaided, and had a goal to either run or improve their running. Participants had to be willing to attend 2 training sessions after school and complete 2 additional exercise sessions at home per week. And children also needed to be able to follow instructions and assessments with no contraindications for strenuous exercise. So the intervention. The intervention included 12 weeks of an individualized program conducted in a group setting. The intervention targeted ankle plantar flexion power and hip flexor power. The key features of the intervention includes calf power exercises, progressing from D-weighted positioning to overground, hip flexor power exercises, again progressing from D-weighted to overground, motor learning exercises for running technique, and transference of learned patterns to overground. Now, for the comparisons, the authors did use a stratified random allocation to either the control or the intervention group, with allocation stratified by age and the high-level mobility assessment tool or the HIMAT. Now for the outcomes. The main measures included normalized speed, stride length, cadence, foot strike pattern, peak ankle power generation, and peak hip flexor power generation in swing and during the propulsion strategy. At follow-up, the intervention group had increased normalized speed of running while the control group got slower. And in running, children with GMSS levels 2 in the intervention group increased in their ankle power while the control group did not change. Now, when they looked at sprinting, GMSS levels 1 and 2 in the intervention group maintained ankle power, while the control group decreased in their ankle power. So though the study did find within group differences, many of these did not result in significant between group differences at follow-up, but this does provide some really good discussion points. The study concludes by suggesting that power generation for running may be responsive to targeted intervention in children with cerebral palsy.
Thanks, Dana. That's such a comprehensive summary. And thank you, Annie, for this massive piece of work. This paper that we're talking about today follows on from some of your previous work where you found that running training for children and adolescents with CP was effective for achieving running goals and increased participation in physical activity at school. So this paper obviously extends on from that. So could you talk to us about, based on what you had done previously, what you thought you might find coming into this study?
Sure, thanks, Ash. So Nuala Gibson, who was one of my supervisors, was the lead author on that paper about the goal attainment and participation.
Yep.
And we did find that there was a significant difference between the control group and the intervention group in terms of goal attainment. So obviously the intervention group attained their running goals and they were their own individual goals. We didn't tell them what their goals were. And also the participation in physical activity at school was better following the intervention compared to the control group. So that was a great start to looking at what the intervention could achieve, but we wanted to understand the mechanics, I suppose, behind those changes.
Yeah.
And so we also had, prior to looking at the effect of the intervention, we actually looked at all the baseline data because we don't have a lot of published data about running in kids with CP. And so we had established that the main deficit, if you like, in terms of the kids with cerebral palsy running is the amount of power they can push off the ground with, which is called A2.
Yep.
And so the intervention actually targeted that particular power. The second thing that people need to do when they run to go fast is to generate power at the hip during swing so that they can move their feet quickly. So this was the second kind of focus of the intervention. So we had established in our baseline data that the kids with cerebral palsy really lacked the push off the ground power at the ankle, but they were actually doing quite well with their hip power.
Okay.
So ideally, we would like that the intervention really increase the amount of power they could generate at the ankle against the ground.
Yeah. So you were able to develop quite specific strategies to target that power generation at the ankle in this intervention that we're talking about today.
Yes. So if you like, that was our primary aim. But we did also target hip power generation because it is important for running quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And running is such an important fundamental movement skill for a lot of activities that children might like to participate in, at school, but also out in their community as well.
Absolutely.
So for the methodology, you conducted a randomized control trial, and I think, lots of our listeners will be familiar with randomized control trials and what they mean now, but you did a particular type of randomization. So you did a stratified random allocation in your study. Could you explain to our listeners what that means and how you actually do it?
Sure. So when you randomly allocate people to two groups, I guess you don't know where they're going to end up. And we had a range of ages in our participants that was between 9 and 18. So we're quite aware that a 9-year-old is quite a lot smaller than an 18-year-old.
Yep.
And that they, the running pattern in typically developing kids should be pretty mature by 9, but we didn't really know in our kids with cerebral palsy. So that was a factor. And then also having kids that were in GMFCS levels 1 and 2, we had a range of functional ability.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to use the HIMAT score because that does actually look at some of those more advanced motor skills like running and skipping and things like that, to make sure that the two groups were roughly equal in terms of the functional ability as well as the age. And so the way that's done, another person, the lovely Marie Blackmore, who wasn't on our study team per se, collected the information about the HIMAT score and the age and just a de-identified kind of code for the participant, and she put them into groups and then she drew them out of an envelope to work out which group they would be in, control or intervention.
Yeah.
That's such a nice way of trying to make the groups as even as possible. So you are actually comparing, quite rightfully so. Otherwise, if you have everyone who's got a, GMS level 1 happens to be in the treatment group, then you're not going to have a very good, clear idea of the intervention.
Yeah. You have all your 18-year-olds in one group.
That's
Power
right.
generation's probably a bit skewed as well.
Yeah, it's so important in cerebral palsy, isn't it, when it's really heterogeneous. So that's a really lovely way of trying to control for that and going for the high level of evidence that is an RCT. Well, Annie, I thought it would be really good now that we've got a bit of an idea of the intervention itself, and now we've spoken about the study methodology. I'd really like to go into the detail about running and the biomechanics of running, because you do refer to this in the paper of the A2 and the H3, and you've got the propulsion strategy. Let's go through each of those and just describe what they are first, because I think they're really important before we get into the intervention and then the results.
Sure.
Okay, fabulous. All right, so A2, can you describe what that is?
So A2 is just a name that's given to that sort of spike of power at the ankle when you push off the ground at the end of your stance phase.
Ah, fabulous. Okay. So what would you expect to see what you'd expect is at the end of stance phase, you'll see that big spike on your graph. So in a child with cerebral palsy, what would you tend to see?
They still have the same pattern, so they still generate power at that point, but it's just not as much power as someone else their age who doesn't have cerebral palsy.
Yeah, sure. So you can really look at that on the graph and be able to quantify that. That's how it comes about. Okay, fabulous. So what about now an H3?
So H3 is a term that's given to the swing power generation at the hip. So that's when you pull your femur through in order to put your next foot down when you're running.
Right, fabulous. And so again, in someone with cerebral palsy, what do you tend to see with an H3?
Well, interestingly, in our baseline paper, we found that the kids with cerebral palsy had very similar levels of power generation at the hip to the kids without. And actually, we think that they're using that as a compensation for not being able to push off the ground quite as hard.
Right. So you would see that again in the graphs. You'd see that the presence that is actually there but it's more likely to be a compensatory strategy. Okay, that's going to be really interesting to talk about a little bit later as well. Okay, so now those two components, the A2 and the H3, really do contribute to the propulsion strategy, or the PS. Not the PlayStation, everyone, propulsion strategy. See, how cool is that? I had to put in a gaming term
Just throwing that in there.
Yeah, okay. Back to focusing. PS. Can you talk us through what that is?
Sure. So this was a term, I suppose, that was originally designed by Sue Morris and her group of researchers who Sue was another one of my supervisors. And it's just a way to show how much of the power that you're generating for going forward in running is generated at the ankle. Because ideally, especially when you're jogging and running, your ankle generates most of the power. And then as you get faster and faster and you kind of max out your stride length, that's when you want to really increase your cadence to keep going even faster, and when you need to start bringing your hip in even more. So the propulsion strategy is basically the proportion of ankle in the total amount of power if you add ankle to hip. So if you like maths, it equals A2 divided by A2 plus H3. And it's just a reflection of how, I might get in trouble for saying this, but in my mind, it's a reflection of how efficient your running is, because the ankle is a lot more efficient at producing power than the hip, because you've got that lovely big gastroc muscle that's a pennate muscle with a nice long tendon that you can put energy in, energy out, a bit like an elastic band, whereas the hip muscles are a lot smaller and you need to actually use more energy to generate power there.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's nice to think about the components of running, because I think anyone who does running, whether you like it or not, there's parts of running that feel harder, and whether that's
all of it.
That could be true. So we can look at the different components there. So, I mean, one of the things that you said was part of your key inclusion criteria was the presence of a flight phase. So that's obviously really important to even put in there, because I gather some children would not even have a flight phase. Can you talk me through that and sort of how the importance of the flight phase and how you can tell someone has one or not? Yeah.
Sure. So a flight phase is really just a time when neither of your feet are in contact with the floor. And it doesn't have to be long. It just has to be there, present, to classify it as running and not walking.
Okay.
Not all kids with cerebral palsy can generate a flight phase. Professor Baum did a paper where they showed that about 67% of kids in GMFCS level 2 could run.
Wow.
And obviously the percentage is much higher in GMFCS level 1.
Yeah.
And then for kids that are classified in GMFCS level 3, it would be unusual, shall we say, to attain to a flight phase.
Yeah. So that's why the focus was on ones and GMFCS level 1s and 2s for your paper?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So already from there, you're getting a really good idea about, what you're looking for. And I understand now when you're looking at your intervention. So let's go into your intervention now, because that's obviously really targeted towards each of those components. Can you talk us through a little bit about, the main strategies behind your intervention and what you were aiming to achieve, I suppose?
Sure. So another one of my supervisors was Dr. Gavin Williams, and he's developed this running training program over quite a number of years, working with young men predominantly with traumatic brain injury. But it hadn't been brought into pediatrics or kids with cerebral palsy or adults with cerebral palsy previously. But the underpinning principles are the same. So if you're training running and you have a person who hasn't got a good push off the ground, then that's where you need to start.
Yeah, okay.
And we know in cerebral palsy there's a lot of literature about strength training and progressive resistive strength training. And we know that they're effective for building strength, but we don't always see a carryover into walking and running.
Right. Yeah.
And we believe that the reason for that is that walking and running are really fast activities. So you actually need to be able to generate strength really quickly when you push off the ground. So this training program is really about the rate of force production. So how quickly can you generate that force? We don't use a lot of heavy weight, but we do use velocity as a progression. So doing things faster. So we start in a de-weighted position and we do lots of hopping and jogging type activities on a board that's called a total gym, and then progress to being up in full body weight position and then doing things faster.
So it's really about trying to replicate the pattern of force production that you would normally use when you're running within the training rather than just like your typical strengthening exercises.
Correct. That's why I call it power and not strength.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And again, it talks to why we need to be so task specific. It doesn't deviate very far at all from what we know the principles that work. And if we do want to work on strength, yes, you work on strength. But if you do want power, you want greater force production for a task like running, then you do need to be task specific with that. So I think that's all in line with what we know, isn't it?
Yeah.
The body of literature.
And I just wanted to ask you another quick question about the intervention because I was reading that the intervention was carried out in a group setting.
Correct.
So how did you find that to be, I suppose, a positive experience for the kids who were in the groups as they were doing the training?
It's one of the things that I actually love about our intervention because a lot of the kids are at mainstream schools and they don't necessarily see other kids that have cerebral palsy very often. And they'd have the loveliest little conversations as they came in and talking about their particular challenges with each other and forming friendships. And it's really lovely. And you can still make it very individualised, but they've got that encouragement and nice social aspect as well, which I think when we're wanting to then put improved skill into participation, those kind of relationships and information sharing are really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, again, that's all in line with what we know, it's that strengths-based approach, isn't it, when you're looking at the F words as well. Friends is a really crucial component of that and seeing other children. I mean, we've seen that time and time again in all the qualitative work, aren't we, Ash?
Yeah, absolutely. If they're enjoying it, then they're more likely to stick at it. And if they're more likely to stick at it, then we're more likely to see, better outcomes, which is what we want, isn't it?
Yep. What a great format. Okay, well, so we've gone through a fair bit of the actual mechanics of running, which I'm taking note of so I can improve my running style. So I did have a question now with regards to, before we get into the results, is I think just to lay the foundation of it, because we do talk about energy expenditure a fair bit and we talk about, compensation versus normalization. And I thought we'd just maybe touch on that before we get into the results. So Annie, what would you say would be, compensatory strategies are we teaching them those strategies, or are we looking for normalizing? So looking at what the normal running mechanics actually are. What is the main strategy here?
Well, before we did this study, I don't think we really knew whether we would be able to achieve normalization or whether we would be better off targeting a compensatory strategy. But in the results, we do see that the kids, especially in GMFCS level 2, did increase their ankle power generation. So I think that that's encouraging to think that we can actually achieve some normalization.
For sure.
Yeah. And I think that is the part of your results that really, really struck me, is that you can make that change. I'm really curious about what you think about why the GMFCS level 2, children of GMFCS level 2 made that kind of improvement. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's complex, but I'll do my best to unpack it. I think when we looked at the baseline data, the kids who were in GMFCS level 1 and had a unilateral cerebral palsy, their unaffected side was actually not different to the typically developing kids.
Right.
So unfortunately, we weren't able to separate our kids into bilateral and unilateral for analysis because we didn't have the numbers.
Sure.
We hadn't even intended to split them into GMFCS level 1 and 2, but then when we started really looking at the data, we could see that even at baseline they were different and what they needed was different, and so then we had to analyse them separately, which left us with not as many people in each group as we really would have liked for statistical significance. But so if we think about the kids in GMFCS level 2 first, they have a much bigger deficit in ankle power generation. So I guess they have more capacity to improve it in a way.
Yeah.
So that's nice. We can get some normalization there. For the kids in GMFCS level 1, they still had a deficit in ankle power generation, but some of them were running just as fast as their typically developing peers.
Right.
So their compensatory strategies were actually working really well for them.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I think, it is complex, and it's probably, as we know, every individual is a little bit different.
Yeah.
And so I can't give you a kind of really clean, let's do this for everyone kind of answer.
But that's this whole area, isn't it? I mean,
Absolutely.
we need randomized control trials to give us a good indication of where we need to be headed, but we still have to individualize. And I guess when we're looking at whether we're compensatory or whether we're going for normalization, it does highlight the strength of an assessment from the physiotherapist and whoever's involved in generating their program to make sure it's really targeted. So, okay, so if we're looking at the differences between GMFCS level 1 and GMFCS level 2, did you find that there were any other differences that you found in your results that we could sort of talk through?
Yes, we did find that the results from the intervention were different between GMFCS level 1 and 2 in a few different areas.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about hip power generation, that kind of ties in with cadence, and cadence is how quickly you turn your feet over when you're running.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the GMFCS level 2 kids actually in the intervention group, their cadence decreased, while the kids in GMFCS level 1 in the intervention group, their cadence increased.
Okay.
But this is part of what I was talking about before,
Yeah.
that the kids in GMFCS level 2, because they can't push off the ground very hard, they tend to rely on moving their feet as quickly as they can, and then they max out and they can't get any faster. So actually the fact that they had learned to push off the ground faster meant that they didn't have to turn their legs over so quickly to go the same speed.
Yeah.
So that was actually a good thing.
Yeah.
Whereas the kids in GMFCS level 1 who were already pushing off the ground better than the kids in GMFCS level 2 increase their power generation at the hip so they could actually turn their feet over faster and go faster. So this is where I mean, we really have to look at the two groups differently.
Yeah.
They weren't, they didn't respond in the same way because their needs were different.
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So, Annie, it'd be good to touch on the results from the control group as well. And you found that there was an increase in the distal deficit during sprinting in the control group, while the intervention group maintained A2 or push-off. Could you explain that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, thank you. So it's interesting that as the control group went through the 12 weeks, actually they lost a bit of power in their ankle in that amount of time. And so I think we think about this as possibly that the effect of that getting slightly older, getting maybe slightly heavier. And we know both in typically developing kids and in kids with cerebral palsy, they do tend to decrease their levels of physical activity in adolescence. So I think it kind of fits with what we know there.
Yeah.
And I guess it speaks to the natural history of somebody with cerebral palsy that they're not necessarily just going to stay the same.
No. And you noted that over, just that 12-week period. So, if you think about that as a relatively small period of time in the scheme of, childhood or adolescence, then that's potentially something that needs to be taken into consideration. Talking
Absolutely.
About
so, even just maintaining your ankle power generation, it might be a good outcome, but to make it better is even better.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we did find in the GMFCS level 2s that their A2 was increased, and that in the GMFCS level 1s they didn't lose any. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So just going back to that, I mean, that really gets me thinking a lot about, in 12 weeks you can lose some of that power generation. Can I ask you whether those children, do you recall if they were wearing ankle foot orthoses as their mainstay all the time? Were they taking them off or leaving them on? You can't help but to think about other factors, because 12 weeks just seems so quick for that to be that kind of decline, particularly in GMFs level 1 and 2. Did you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say because each individual obviously is different. We had some kids who used AFOs during the day at school, but not all. Yeah. And we obviously had a range of what kids were participating in terms of their school participation and then outside of school as well. Yeah. So, and we also didn't control for Botox. So that's obviously a factor. People would have been receiving Botox at different times and that could be a confounding factor, but unknown really.
Yeah. I think all it really highlights is just that we need to keep an eye on our kids and keep them as active as possible. And the goal might not always be to improve, but to maintain. And that's equally as important when you're thinking about muscle health and all the things we talked about with Dr. Sian Williams not too long ago as well. Hey?
Absolutely. And that, the 24-hour
movement guidelines
and that, activity looks different for everyone, but every little bit counts. Yeah. And I think that, speaks to this point as well.
That's right. Yeah. Just one last question before we start talking about the future. I did want to ask you a little bit about dosage because you did note in your paper that, maybe 12 weeks wasn't quite enough given there weren't, any between group differences, and that was something you guys did put forward. So what do you think? I mean, what would that look like in terms of intervention? Do you have an idea of how long it should be or what other format it could be implemented in?
Sure. I think we saw in our kids in our intervention in this RCT that some came 20 times and or 24 times. We had someone who came every single time. And then there was a range of how often people attended. And we haven't had a chance yet to really look at dosage in terms of who did better, how many times did they come, what was their adherence to their home program like. So that would be really interesting. I would love to look at that data when we have time. But I've been thinking about it and, running this program clinically now for several years. What we've seen, I guess, just from my experience is that when you run it in a school term, that's 10 weeks, which is not really enough. But if they come back for a second term, we see them make really good gains in that second term.
Sure.
So they're doing 20 weeks really with a little break in the middle for school holidays. And I think that's a good length of time to really see some decent changes. And when you look at the strength training guidelines for power training and things, 20 weeks is not unreasonable.
That's right.
And often, in that world, they do train for a lot longer than we often think of in our physio world. So, if I got the chance to do a bigger trial with more kids, which I think is totally where we should go, I would probably make the training period of time a little bit longer. But I think doing the twice a week is good.
Yeah.
Because you need that intensity for the motor learning.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's really cool.
And 2 terms is something that, if you can explain that to families, that's something that's achievable and they can, work towards that goal of
especially
attendance.
if running is really important goal. Yeah. So there is that motivation to want to do that. And getting the right dosage is really important, isn't it? There's no point going too far under that because you won't get those gains and that reward for all that work
exactly
that they've done. Yeah.
So Annie, you kind of touched on it a little bit with that last answer, but based on everything that you learnt from this paper and the body of work that preceded this paper, where would you like to take future work in this area?
There's so many questions. We have a lot of data that will allow us to do a lot more analysis. We've also been looking at leg stiffness, which is about how you can use your stretch shortening cycle to pump energy in and out efficiently.
Okay.
So we've got a baseline paper published about that and one that's under review about the effect of the intervention.
Fantastic.
So that's just one thing that's interesting to look at. There's lots of things. But I think given that we ended up having to split our cohort into GMFCS level 1 and 2 for analysis, it'd be really nice to do a multi-centre trial where you could get more kids.
Yeah.
You could look at GMFCS 1 versus 2, unilateral versus bilateral, and have the numbers to be able to do that real specific analysis.
Yeah, and that's a really fantastic way of making sure that you are able to get those numbers because we know, as you start to get more specific with the comparisons you want to make, you do need more more children. So the more people you can involve, the better.
Oh, absolutely. Really excited to see the work for that for the future. Well, thank you, Annie. We're about to head into our next segment now, which has become like our most popular part of the segment for the show. I think we've had a lot of feedback about it. So this is all about Tell It to Ed. Now, Ed is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, or so he says. I feel like I don't even know this man anymore. He seems to know more and more about it, but this is a great opportunity to have a bit of a 60-second pitch to the common man, Ed, as he used to be called, about what your research is all about. So take it away, Annie.
Well, Ed, my research in kids with cerebral palsy is about their running and whether we can help them to run faster and more powerfully. So we did a training program which had a lot of jumping and hopping and that kind of activity, and found that we could actually help them to get more powerful in their running, which helped them to go faster.
Cool. Nice and succinct.
Very cool.
Love nice one, Annie. Well, over to you, Ed. Do you have any questions for Annie?
As usual, I have lots of questions. Again, I keep getting told that I only have time for one.
That's right, just one.
But I guess the Olympics is about to happen, and there's lots of sprint and track stars who are kind of making their way in the media, and I watch YouTube a lot, so occasionally these things kind of popped up. One of the things that did pop up for me was a couple of videos by Nike about the kind of shoes that their athletes wear and what performance-enhancing features and stuff that they have. Is there anything like that in the disability world, in the therapy world, where pieces of equipment have very definitive improvements for people to be able to run or to walk or to move, or is it like we suspect with Nike that some of it is placebo?
What are you suggesting?
Nike, my goodness. Ed.
Oh, I love Nike. I have Nike products, so I'm just putting it out there just to...
If they want to sponsor the podcast.
I know. If I understand your question correctly, and I think about it for our kids with cerebral palsy, no, not really. They do wear some ankle foot orthoses, so they can have some splints, and some of those are designed to have some spring in them. Mm-hmm. But it can be quite hard to run in those because they're usually made to help your walking, which is heels down, whereas running is kind of on your toes.
Yeah.
But obviously you've got all your blades and things for your below-knee amputees, which are pretty cool.
Yeah. So is there a business idea here?
I was going to say, you might have just stumbled across to the next thing, Ed.
Well, actually, it's really interesting that you asked that question because I'm in the middle of supervising some master's students who are looking at some of our data to see what is the difference in kids with cerebral palsy running with shoes as to barefoot. And that's something that hasn't been published before. So I'll keep you posted.
Nice.
It's a really
I'll
good
have
question.
to get cracking on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good question because, I think that's always the question, isn't it? What kind of shoes should we get and what should we be using? And I'm not sure we have a good answer for that in terms of running and whether some of these really fancy push-off kind of shoes with good toe-off, mechanisms would work for our children. But it'd be a great space to look into. Cool. Well, thank you so very much, Annie, for being on the podcast. We've loved the chat with you today. And for everyone who's listening, thank you so much for tuning in. As usual, the run sheet notes will be available on our website, researchworks.net. And of course, if you want this recorded as part of your CPD requirements, there's a form that you can fill out so you can keep the record of your PD and you can have your reflection notes there as well.
Next week, we have Dr. David Hobbs joining us on the show. David Hobbs is a senior lecturer in rehabilitation engineering at the College of Science and Engineering at Flinders University in South Australia. He's got extensive experience as a rehabilitation engineer in the field of disability, rehab, engineering and assistive technologies. And we all know how much technology is developing in this space, so we're really excited to talk to him about developments in this area, and we hope that you can join us.
Oh, I hope you can join us. Thank you so much for being on the show, Annie. See you later.
Annie.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.